We are here with Chris Raymond. He wrote a book about the Penn State football comeback after the Sandusky scandal. Chris Raymond, a 1983 graduate of Scranton Prep High School, joins us. Chris, let's start this the day the sanctions came out, July 23rd in 2012. I think Penn State's program thought they were going to get a hand slap. They got much more than that. Not just the sanctions, not just the loss of 111 victories that came back. That's right. The bowl ban, which was sort of rescinded in half. But then the opportunity for the players to just jump out and go anywhere. That was a disservice to the football program. And how do you think Penn State handled it, if not by the administration, but by everybody else?
Yeah, I think they were not prepared for that extent, penalties to that extent at all. They thought this was like not an on-the-field infraction, so they weren't expecting deep sanctions. So they were genuinely surprised when they heard about the bowl ban, when they heard about the victories that were sort of taken away.
111.
And I think, the NCAA did this out of sort of nobleness, allowing the players to kind of transfer at any time, but that ended up really being the biggest penalty for them, because instantly you had people on Penn State's campus trying to recruit those players away from the program.
It was a criminal act by Jerry Sandusky, and yet the NCAA tried to take that as some kind of under their umbrella decision. Do you think the outreach what they should have been doing?
Yeah, I absolutely think they did. Yeah, they had to search long and hard to try and find some sort of penalty or some sort of like guideline that Penn State had broken. And in the end, I think what they came up with was
it sounds like some legalese.
It really does. They basically penalized them for failing to uphold the fundamental values of civility, honesty, and responsibility. And as I said in the book, what does that mean? Nobody knew exactly what that meant.
And then if you go back to Joe Paterno era and even right now, I mean, a lot of what they're saying, Penn State exemplifies to a T.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it was, we're talking about the crimes of, like I would say, a monster that the school and the program kind of went through. But none of that had anything to do with the football that was actually played on the field, and certainly not those players that were there at that time. I mean, Joe...
they were in grade school when the last part of this was
That's
done.
right. They had never met Sandusky. They had no idea who he was.
So the bottom falls out. They're going through quicksand on the 23rd. 2 days later, a remarkable moment when two of the greatest leaders we ever had. I grew up with Zordich's dad and Rich Mouty trying to score against Alabama there at the end. So Mike Mouty, who's unbelievable in the book, and Mike Zordich come out and they make their statement. What was the statement? And I think that's where Penn State just began to get their footing.
Yeah, and I will say for me that struck home really deeply. Anybody who's covered Penn State football, I know you have, knows that players did not call their own press conferences at the time when Joe Paterno was there.
And they don't now with Franklin.
That's right. So the fact that these players actually called their own press conference and went out there with no guidance really on their own to kind of make that statement was really remarkable in my mind. And I think if you're watching what was happening with the Board of Trustees, with the administration, there was like radio silence up until that point. So to have these players come out and make a statement and say one man did not build this program, one man is not going to tear this program down, was really striking. To have the players say that, but they also were just pitch perfect in their message. Like they were the ones that stepped forward and said like, hey, this is what the school is about. It's about success with honor. That's what the program's been about all along.
Correct.
We're not going to let this one man destroy that. We're not going to toss that all out.
You know, Chris mentioned as far as the administration was a little bit silent, maybe a little more than a little. And even I thought the Board of Trustees could have done more, but then they were petrified of what the NCAA slapped down on them.
Oh, yeah.
The players, meaning the people on the team, the alumni, which is the largest alumni base in the country, and the lettermen especially.
Right.
Isn't it inspiring to you that how those lettermen stepped up and met those players and told them, forge ahead?
Yep.
You know, it's a dark moment, but there are so many bright moments that we have at Penn State.
That's right.
I thought that was remarkable.
I think for like Penn State fans, you were kind of waiting for somebody to kind of step forward and do that, right? And say, hey, wait a second, I understand that horrible crimes have been committed. We want the person that committed those crimes to pay the penalty for them. But again, the idea of tossing everything out, the whole history of the program, right? That whole idea of success with honor that Paterno had brought along was heartbreaking. And so when these players stepped forward and said, hey, we're not going to let that happen, people rallied around them. And you're right, it was the players, it was the lettermen that really kind of looked and said, hey, we're going to get behind these guys right away. Because most people don't realize those Letterman Club, those players had played for Joe Paterno for 50 years. So it's a remarkable thing that you have players who for 50 years had all been through the exact same experience. It really kind of bonded them together tight. And so for them, it was really moving, the idea that these players would kind of step forward and take a stand like that.
All right, so you said moving. Let's move the treadmill. They go 0-2 in 2012. Ohio, Virginia 17-16. I think everybody out there knows the Sam Ficken game. Yes. And yet somehow they keep it together, and then they win the last game of the year, as I interviewed Matt Stankiewicz at midfield, on a field goal by Sam Ficken to beat Wisconsin.
That's right.
In your book, you're covering a 5-season climb.
Yep.
Just in that one season,
yep,
you had that encompassed.
Yeah, it was remarkable. I mean, I have to say, like, when I was thinking about this book, I remembered that moment with the players kind of stepping forward. You know, I remembered the Big Ten championship and how much that game meant to me. And I just thought, nobody's really tried to tell the story of those 5 years in between. And is it possible to kind of string, you know, those dots together, connect the dots, and what kind of story would you get? And I was really, really pleased in the end with what I got. There was just so much drama throughout that. And that 2012 season, all by itself, you know, they've done a documentary on just that, was filled with that.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, I read the book.
Yep.
And I read it in like 4 days. So, like I said, it's a breezy read, but it's a harrowing read at times. It's an oral history, meaning that you didn't write as much as the words as you elicited the comments from the people that were involved, right? So let's start with Bill O'Brien. How important was he?
Oh, huge, huge.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. You know, there are still programs that are trying to kind of replace, and Nebraska's still trying to find somebody to kind of replace their longtime coach. Florida State is still trying to do that. Penn State, in the first try, ends up getting Bill O'Brien, a man that most people were not familiar with, came from outside of the program, but he was pitch perfect. I mean, I talked to the strength trainer. He was one of the first interviews I did, Craig Fitzgerald, and he just said, that guy, first time head coaching position, and in the 2 years he was there, did not make one incorrect decision. That's pretty remarkable. And he got the players to kind of buy in right away and managed to kind of make it, you know, coach them through that upheaval of those first 2 games. Everything could have collapsed right then and there.
I know Matt McGloin told me he learned more in 1 year under O'Brien than he did those other years all coming up, you know, through those 3 or 4 years. Let's talk about that. The local players on there. You got McGloin and Shrive from West Scranton, Stankiewicz, the center from Blue Mountain, Walker you interviewed from Central Mountain, Fignano, Williamsport. You got Ladonis, the long snapper of Berwick, Gino Lewis,
yep,
which is, you know, Valley West and Berwick. What imprint did our local players have on your book? Because if you're from Northeast and Central Pennsylvania, a lot of the names and a lot of the games are going to come back to you.
Yeah, well, I think you start with Matt McGloin right away. I mean, he kind of epitomized really what that team became over those next 5 seasons. You're talking about a guy who was started off as a walk-on player. I mean, he hates the idea that people considered him a walk-on.
Well, he won the
record that he had here.
For it,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. But, you know, Craig Fitzgerald said to me, too, like, you couldn't have had another person at quarterback for that team. I mean, the grit that he, you know, exemplified, the fact that, I mean, he was just a stand-up guy, high-character guy, and he was the kind of player that people could rally around. And I think that's what you get. You know, those are the kinds of players that you get from around here, right? The players that are willing to put in the work.
Yeah.
The players that have that sort of high character, right? They do it for the right reasons. And they, you know, they don't back down. I mean, what they went through over the next 5 seasons was a very huge trial, right? You had the national media that was kind of like
almost wanting them to fail.
Exactly. You had these NCAA sanctions. I mean, when you look at the scholarship reductions and what they did to that team over the next 4 or 5 seasons, you know, they were playing against Ohio State and Michigan with a team that was, you know, only had like 1/3 the scholarships. Right. You know, so you needed those kind of players really to kind of rally around, right, and to make that work.
You had some low moments and you covered them, you know, losing to Temple and losing the teams you probably didn't think you would lose to. But then you have the 4 overtime win against Michigan. And then, obviously, I guess Penn State finally was back when they beat Ohio State with the block punt with Allen and Haley.
That's right.
But were you surprised, even through those fallow moments, they did as well as they did? Because it wasn't 2012 where those sanctions.
That's right.
It was 13, 14, and 15 where they were taking effect.
That's right. 2012, they still had a very good team. You know, they had lost Silas Redd, their number one running back.
USC.
Yes, and that was a little difficult kind of getting a running game going after that. But they had the talent. They had NFL talent on those teams. When you looked at those succeeding years, right, 2014 and 2015 in particular, they were really down. I mean, they were using a lot of walk-on players to kind of fill out the roster on that team. And so it was a dogfight, and yet you still ended up having a 4-overtime win against Michigan, right? You still end up having big wins against Wisconsin at the end of those 2 seasons.
Right.
So they still had those upsets that were there.
All right, so real quick, we're going to move, but there's four people I still want you to get to.
Okay.
And some have their moments, and, you know, Coach Franklin, Christian Hackenberg,
Yep.
Saquon Barkley, and Trace McSorley.
Yep.
Let's start with Franklin. Your thoughts on how he has done since he took over a very difficult position.
Right. Well, I think there again, you're sort of trying to replace, you know, Joe Paterno. You're replacing with, you know, Bill O'Brien. 2 years in, you got to do this all over again, and you end up hiring this coach from Vanderbilt, you know, who very few people knew about. The players were surprised he was the pick. And I think it was a little difficult early on because he came in and I think he wanted to kind of do rah-rah again, and the players were just so used to Bill O'Brien and the way that he kind of let them go about their business. Right. But he did, you know, he brought in some phenomenal recruits, and again, the program just didn't fall backward. At no point in that stretch did they have a losing season. I think that's a credit to those 2 coaches that they had come in.
And then Hackenberg took a beating, and beating physically, but also mentally.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in terms of the story, the 60 players that I interviewed, people that I interviewed for the book, I think that his is the most important story. I mean, I think nobody paid a greater price for those penalties than Christian Hackenberg. He came in as the number 1 recruit, had a phenomenal freshman season with Bill O'Brien, ended up being like sort of rookie of the year, right, for the Big Ten Network. Yeah.
NFL prospect
and then
right
they
away.
had just had nobody to put on those offensive lines. They were really trying to makeshift, you know, create lines.
Paris Palmer from Lackawanna, that didn't work.
Yeah, and he ended up just getting sacked throughout, you know, his final 2 seasons there. And I think in large part that's why, you know, he didn't succeed as a pro, right? That impacted his thinking, that impacted his mechanics. And so I think he made the ultimate sacrifice. He sacrificed what would have been, I think, a very successful NFL career if this had not happened.
Maybe the most popular player in Penn State history. I always thought Lenny Moore maybe was the best player because he's in the College and Pro Football Hall of Fame. But Saquon, I mean, the character of the man, the talent of the man. And I still love him even though I'm a New York Giants fan and he's with the Eagles. But just to get him at that program, he was going to go to Rutgers. He didn't want to go back on his word. And yet, I think more any one player, like maybe Hackenberg's the crux of the book, but the rebirth, the phoenix coming out of the ashes, it's Saquon that made it happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have to say, like, I think there's a large measure of kismet that happens in here. Like, there's a lot of sort of courage, there's a lot of hard work to go into this. But the fact that that player of Saquon's caliber ends up on the staff on the team at Penn State, on that campus, in the school's hour of need, is still something that's remarkable to me. I don't know how that happens exactly. I mean, he wasn't like the number 1 sort of recruit coming out at running back, but he had a really strong senior season in high school. And I don't think anybody knew what to expect from him when he set foot on campus, but immediately had an immediate impact on the program, and not just from the what he was able to do on the field, which was almost freakish when you kind of saw him leaping over players and
the USC
talent that he had, but just his workroom ethic and the weight room ethic really convinced a lot of players, hey, we got to be there, we got to start working harder. And we're talking about a guy who would just stay there on the field at the end of games and sign autographs for like an hour afterwards. I mean, you couldn't
with opposing fans.
Exactly. You just could not have asked for a better ambassador for Penn State football, right? And then that's, I think, a large part why people sort of end up moving on from the Sandusky scandal, because how could you, dislike, or not respect a player of, Saquon's caliber?
Just that smile. And the last one is McSorley. Trace his lineage, pardon the pun, but a champion in high school at every season, and then brought that to Penn State, despite being like me, 6 feet, 190.
Right. Yes. And that was the big knock, right? He just wasn't big enough. He didn't have the sort of size to sort of compete in Division I. He ends up on the campus because James Franklin had recruited him and said, you're a quarterback, not a defensive back, which I think a lot of other teams wanted to do. So he follows Franklin to Penn State. Again, how does that happen? This guy ends up on the field, takes over, right, in his sophomore season after 1 year of backing up Christian Hackenberg, and leads the team to a Big Ten championship. And again, when you combine him with Saquon Barkley, I mean, the highlight films week after week were just remarkable, I think, for college football to kind of see Penn State playing at that level, right? I think people were able to kind of rally around that team right away. And I do think that by then you were kind of like, okay, this program has succeeded. It's come back from like what was almost a certain death sentence. And it was because of those guys.
It's a remarkable story. It's a remarkable book. And again, what Chris did is he did, did you say 60? I thought it was maybe more like 100, but many interviews. Spider Caldwell, the equipment manager, Fitzgerald, the strength coach, the head coaches that came through there, and of course so many players from Northeast Pennsylvania. In 5 years, Penn State wins a Big Ten championship when I thought the NCAA was trying to give them a death knell. Remarkable. So my question to you is, 5-10 years from now, where do you see Penn State's program?
Well, there's no question that Penn State was back among the elite. They've tried for a number of years now to sort of crack the playoff, the college football playoff. And when it was confined to 5 teams, that's a very tall order, especially when you have to sort of get past Ohio State and Michigan in the Big Ten.
They were the hurdles,
right? So I do think we'll see them enter the playoffs, and I think you're going to see them win a national championship in that next 10 years. And I think the program is in very good standing right now under James Franklin with the recruits that he continues to bring in. So,
we are
Penn State?
Yeah. Tell them where you can get the book.
Thank you very much. It's available wherever books are sold. If you actually go right now to Barnes & Noble online, you can pre-order it at 25% off.
All right. Chris Raymond, Men in White. Get it. You'll love it. Well, if you're from northeastern or central Pennsylvania, you'll recognize the names. McGloin and Shrive from West Scranton, Stankiewicz of Blue Mountain. Out in the central region, Walker from the Central Mountain area, and Fignato of Williamsport. In the Wyoming Valley Conference, we even had guys like Gino Lewis and Zach Ladonis of Berwick. And then, of course, Brandon Smith and Ryan Kaiser out there from Lewisburg and Selinsgrove. Not only did these guys make a play, they decided to stay.